Hey, we are about to jump on a Zoom call with an awesome guy that I'm really excited to introduce you to. His name is Doug Allan. So there's so much cool stuff about him that I've just written a few dot points down so I didn't have to try and remember it all in my little brain because I only drew drawings. So when you watch films on TV of wildlife and landscapes and all these amazing little bugs flying around, you don't know who takes the images or who's behind the camera. So I want to introduce you to Doug because he's been filming in the industry for over 40 years in the Arctic and Antarctic. So over that time, Doug has gained knowledge for the land and animals, which shows a deep concern for the environment and the issues that polar bears face in the polar regions. Doug Allan graduated in marine biology. He learned to dive and nailed the job unexpectedly last minute in the British Antarctic Survey, where he spent 9 years in the Antarctic. He was a diver, scientist, photographer, and a base commander there. He's done films such as Life in the Freezer, Polar Bear Special, The Blue Planet, and Frozen Planet, to name a few. So we're just about to jump on the call now, and you'll get to meet him very soon.
A few moments later.
Yeah, I can hear you fine. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we're like in between about to get a storm, and then I'm in the studio with a tin roof, so we're hoping it doesn't rain.
Yeah, I know it's like there used to be an airport. I don't know whether there still is. There used to be an airport in Buenos Aires, and rain at certain times of year in Buenos Aires in Argentina, absolutely guaranteed at between about 4 o'clock for an hour and a half. And when the rain came down on this roof, you could not talk from one side of the check-in desk to the other. It was absolutely the worst design ever. And this was a new airport. And you have to think, who designs these feckin' things? Anyway.
I know, but it's good for sleeping. Rain on tin roof is awesome for sleep.
Well, whatever turns you on, you know.
Well, I've just written down a few little dot pointy things to talk to you about.
Mm-hmm.
So can you tell us what you're working on at the moment?
Well, the old COVID crisis has hit home hard here. Everything at the moment, we're pretty much in a full-on lockdown, so there's not a lot of filming going on. And I was lined up to do a number of presentations, and they've all either disappeared or they've gone online, which is different. I am working up a couple of ideas. I've got one idea about whales, and I've got another idea about climate change. So I'm working on them. I'm working them up as ideas and pitching them in the way of potential commissioners. But it is a problem because we don't know how long COVID is going to interfere with international travel. And these do involve international travel and also involve taking old people to locations around the world, which is probably even worse. So I'm living in hope for better things next year.
Yeah, okay, cool. These presentations that you're doing, is it something that people in Australia can sign up for and watch?
Well, I don't know. I mean, like I say, at the moment, these are just projects that are looking for commissioning, looking for development money. I was working on a couple of films for a marine conservation body over here, which had filming planned over the summer, but that again just hit the skids because it involved working from boats, and there's just all kinds of rules and regulations that came up with COVID. So I think that's all been postponed until next year because November, December is not a time to be offshore in Scotland. It's a bit lumpy and, very short days and all the rest of it. So there's a few things on hold, but there's nothing imminently coming up that I will have filmed, so to speak. But I don't know about your end, but over here, the like of the BBC and around the world, things that I've been involved with in the past, Planet Earth, Blue Planet, what have you, they're often available through Netflix or some of the streaming services. So I'm I'm never too far from being on the screen somewhere.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, like, yeah, because in Australia, we're not in lockdown anymore. We haven't been in lockdown in the state we are for
Yeah.
a couple of months. Yeah, so it's weird to hear that the rest of the world is still suffering so much. Like, we've only had one state in Victoria, Melbourne, that was really bad, and they're just announcing lockdowns open. So at the moment, everyone's traveling for Christmas, and I guess it's the bonus of living on an island, right?
Well, I mean, Australia is a big island, but my son is in New Zealand at the moment. He's been there for a couple of years, and I mean, they've had it. They locked down for a while, but everything has opened up again. But UK, Europe is currently having it bad. I mean, UK has had over 50,000 deaths between the earlier periods, or from March until June or so, when that was the first wave, and then they opened up for the summer, and it's just restarted again. So I think there's been about 7,000 or 8,000 deaths in the last 6 weeks or so, and that's why we've gone back into a lockdown to try to get the numbers down, so that I suppose Christmas can be opened up again. But the problem is that we'll all open up over Christmas, and then by the middle of January, end of January, we'll be locking down again. So, I don't know, and everybody's very excited about these vaccines, but I'm not, I think it's going to take a long time for their full effect to filter through. So I think with one thing and another, we're faced with some pretty challenging travel commitments, especially internationally, for the next, at least until the middle of next year, and possibly longer.
Yeah. Well, I guess on the plus side, at least people have lots of videos to catch up on. Films to watch.
That's true. Yeah, Netflix must be made. Shares in Netflix must have gone zooming up. Yeah. Anyway,
Yeah,
but this is it's good to be involved with your project, which is ongoing as we speak. So that's I feel very flattered to be involved so intimately with you. I can see why, the idea you want to obviously base your pictures on real scenery, so to speak. And it was great that David got in. It was great that David wrote back enthusiastically, but that's typical David. And typical David to respond with a little handwritten letter. I have a number of those that he's written me over the years, and I keep them all, very, very carefully. I keep them all, somewhere where I can look at them, where I have them for the future, because he's a great man. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah, well, I took mine straight to the framer and I framed it on the wall. It's up.
Oh. Yeah. Well,
but,
that's great.
That actually brings me to my next part of what I was going to ask you, because I've been following your work for some time now, and so in the COVID lockdown, that's when I reached out to David and wrote him a letter, and because obviously the mail took a lot longer because
we're having locking up
and I never
connection stable. Are you still hearing me? Because
yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, okay. Well, you locked up there, so I missed the last bit of your comment.
Oh, right. Yeah. So the main thing about COVID is I had all this time I wrote David a letter through COVID, and I never expected a reply. I didn't even think it would make it to your side of the world because of all the postage in lockdown. It was just taking forever. And in the meantime, I was researching your work, and I saw that your book had international postage. I knew you released the book a while ago, and I didn't know that was going to be an option. Like, I asked bookstores and no one could get it in. And so I thought, I'll just buy it. And then I contacted your manager and asked him if I could have your address to write you a letter. And then 2 hours later, you responded to me with the international postage question. And it was mind blowing, and it actually reminded me of your story with David and how you approached him for the first time when you popped up out of the water. And I was like, this is the same moment that I'm having with you. So I just wanted you to maybe share your experience and your story that when you were working under the water and David was sitting on the iceberg and you popped up, and you could tell it.
Well, it was kind of like that. What happened was I was working in the Antarctic as a diver and as a scientist. I was basically supporting. I was a dive marshal on a British Antarctic survey base, and I'd been down there for a couple of years, diving through the winter and the summer. And we got a radio call from a naval ship one day, quite out of the blue. And it said, we're coming to visit your island and we've got a BBC film crew on board and they would like to come ashore for a couple of days. So we said, fine. And I don't think even at that point we knew that David Attenborough was on board. Anyway, we said, fine. And they turned up off our shore and the film crew helicoptered ashore. And at that point, I think we did know it was David. Anyway, there was only 4 of them. There was David, there was a cameraman, sound man, and a producer. And they stayed on our island for only a couple of days, but it fell to me to sort of help them. I had the dive store, which was a big enough space for them to get their equipment unloaded and sort out things. And then I had flexibility of my time that I was able to take them to different parts of the island, either by boat or walking, to get David in front of the animals or the scenery that he wanted to talk about. So I wasn't much with movie at all. And so I watched them and I was listening to them. And to be honest, it just seemed to me that here were 4 people having a really good time. I mean, they were doing something worthwhile, obviously. There was a certain glamour, let's say, attached to it. But basically, they seemed to be doing all the things that I enjoyed doing. They were traveling, they were working with wildlife, they were doing something worthwhile. But most of all, they were just a really fun group to be with. So I was thinking about this. So anyway, yes, one day I was diving. I had one dive to make with the cameraman who wanted to get some shots underwater. So I took him in, and while he was, inevitably engrossed in his subject, and I had a chance to think, I thought, come up after that dive and effectively pop up out of the water and say, sorry?
Rewind one sentence. You lost it for a little bit.
You mean you want that shortened?
No, that's good.
No, it's
so I missed the bit. You froze. Just the computer froze, and I was like, "You gone?"
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I don't know. I think it must be the connection at your end. I think because normally mine would come up unstable.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I had to summarize in a sentence. Basically, I was working in the Antarctic as a diver, and David and a film crew turned up at our base. I helped them for a couple of days, and by the end of that time, I knew I wanted to do something similar. So I asked David and the others, "How do you get into the business?" They explained certain things, and that was it. I took it from there.
Yeah, awesome. That was very short and quick, isn't
it? I can finish off the long one, and the longer one you can cut back and forward. Do you want something half in between, and we hope it doesn't freeze up?
That was fun. That was good, guys. Yes, they like it.
Okay. Right.
Storytelling.
I like the long form.
Yeah, we like the long form.
Well, to finish off the long form, as I said, I just was thinking about this through the dive, and at the end of the dive, I more or less came up, and David was on the slipway, and almost as I came out of the water, I said to him, "Look, I'm really enjoying working with you guys. How do I get to do the job that your cameraman is doing?" And they all explained it, and it suddenly, but David was the catalyst really for me moving into wildlife filming.
Yeah, That's amazing, I guess. So that was your next 30 years of your career, was filming with BBC and with the films that David had voiced over?
Well, I met David in 1981, and it took about maybe 4 years to move to a place where I could say I was making a living from filming. But yes, since then, it's been a lot of my work has been with the BBC, pardon me, working on their big series, and inevitably that means working at times with David. But I have worked for lots of people, pardon me. You know, I've worked for Discovery and National Geographic and now Netflix and
Again.
things like that. Also, probably the wildlife is what I'm best known for.
Yeah. We're just it's starting to rain here and connection is going in and out. Typical. I'll try and what's the weather radar doing? Checking the weather radar to see how long we got.
That's. I mean, if we have to come back, it's no problem. You know, any of the other times. I know what it's like.
Okay.
Go on.
The next question is, so with your conservation work and your love of animals and the environment, what charities or conservation organisations do you like to support?
Well, I have for a long time been a member of the Marine Conservation Society here in UK, and they're a great bunch because they've got a big membership. They organise all kinds of practical things during the year, beach cleans, what have you, surveys of the coast, things like that. But they also realise that the levers of power are held by governments and persuading them to pass regulations. So they've got fingers into important lobby groups and into important influential areas. And they asked me to be an ambassador for their society a few years ago. So I've been quite involved with some of the things that they do. And just generally my feeling is that among all there are many conservation bodies doing good work. There's a Whale and Dolphin Conservation Society here in UK as well. There's Greenpeace. There's everything from local up to international aggressive acts, let's say. But I find that the MCS, a combination of them doing things from a basic level up to higher political level, I think that they're a very good conservation body. In the last few years, I did a number of films for people called Living Oceans Foundation, which was across in America. That was more coral reef based. Unfortunately, they ran into financial issues, partly because they were being funded from somewhere in the Middle East, and the funding dried up a bit. But I really enjoyed working for them because that was very different. That was warm water, etc. And coral reefs, of course, as you know, are in quite a lot of danger around the world. But generally, my advice to conservation, to people who would like to help conservation generally, is that look around. There's a huge range of them. If you want to do something at a local level, it may be that you want to look at that local level. If you're into physical things like cleaning rivers or cleaning up environments, then get involved with people who do that. But if you're more writing, campaigning, what have you, then there may be other ones. But of course, it really depends too which particular aspect of conservation you're interested in. It's very different if you're marine based or if you care a lot about African wildlife or something like that. But definitely any sort of conservation effort all conservation efforts are highly worthwhile at this time, because the planet needs all the help it can get.
So in that case, what would you say to people that don't believe in global warming and
well, it's interesting. Yeah. Well, it's funny, climate change, until fairly recently, or maybe even at the moment, you have a climate skeptical government, really. And this is very odd to me, because in some respects they seem to be very sensible, but in this respect they've just completely lost it. But I kind of get it, because the Australian economy is very dependent on, one of its big selling points is selling all that coal and all your natural fossil fuel deposits and things. But I think that if you don't believe in it, you either haven't read enough about it, or you have got a closed mind, because the science, I don't like going back to science, let's call it proof. The proof is absolutely out there. You can see it with your own eyes, and if you choose to read and understand it, then you're led to no other conclusion but climate change is happening. In fact, it's not climate change, it's climate breakdown. And having said that, the Australian government perhaps doesn't believe in it, you only need to look back to your awful forest fires, wildlife fires from a year ago. And if that is going to be the new normal, then Australia's in trouble.
Yeah, agreed. And in saying that, so what concerns me the most is the glaciers that are melting. And I guess because we're not in the part of the world where we see any of that, and it's like we're in Queensland, so most people in Queensland haven't even seen snow or felt cold past -0. So for people that don't really understand that, well, in the 30 years that I've been on this planet, is it about 40% of the ice has melted in the polar region?
Well, it's very different, the Arctic from the Antarctic. The Antarctic is a massive continent covered with ice, whereas if you go to the Arctic, you've basically got a frozen ocean at the top of the world. But that ocean is an absolutely crucial habitat. The biggest lump of ice in the north is in Greenland, but the Greenland ice cap has nothing like the volume that the Antarctic has. But on the other hand, the northern hemisphere does seem to be more affected perhaps by climate change than the southern hemisphere, and certainly the disappearance or the reduction in the amount of ice cover on that Arctic Ocean is having huge influences on global weather, but a massive local influence. There's a lot of animals, obviously top of the chain is the polar bear, but there's a lot of animals that are completely dependent on that sea ice, and not just sea ice per se, but sea ice is lots of different habitats. It's very different if it's flat, what they call first year ice versus lumpy, multi-year, where it's built up over several years. But generally speaking, in the two statistics in the Arctic, as far as Arctic sea ice is concerned, is that the ice itself in winter is 40% thinner than it used to be 40 years ago. So the winter sea ice is not so thin. And in terms of the area of sea ice that covers the Arctic Ocean in summer, when we measure that in September, when the sea ice cover is at a minimum, when there's maximum melt, so to speak, then there's been a huge reduction between, over the last 30 years, there's only about half of the sea ice cover that there used to be. So the Arctic, unless we do something, is headed for much less ice up there. And the rate of melt from Greenland, the actual amount of ice melting off Greenland, is increasing. And if you take a lump of ice, which is on land, like it is on Greenland, and then slide it into the ocean, then you add to the volume of the ocean. So Greenland is adding significantly to rise of sea level around the world. And the same sort of thing is happening in the Antarctic, a little bit slower, because you can think of the Antarctic as being like a freezer full of ice. If you have a freezer full of ice and you open the door, then it takes much longer for that ice to begin to melt because there's such a store of cold in there. But the Antarctic is starting to melt and warm, and there are large areas of the Antarctic where there's a lot of concern that the rate of melt, the rate of speed of the glaciers and what have you, is increasing. And the big problem with both of those areas is that it's adding volume to the sea, and it's producing a ever-increasing sea level rise. And that's a huge problem for cities around the world, and indeed for some of the small nation states, which really are only a matter of feet above sea level. And add on a storm surge on top of the rise, at the top of the higher sea level, and we're going to lose some island states in the next 20 or 30 years, probably, to rising sea levels
Yeah.
caused by climate change.
But there was one, there was one place that, one campaign that you were on, and you woke up in the morning and, like, you woke up in the morning and all the ice had broken around you, and you were lucky to get the helicopter to come and get you before it just disintegrated.
Yeah, well, you know, I have drifted away actually, or been caught on drifting ice on 2 or 3 occasions. And certainly one of those occasions was just, you know, kind of our fault, in as much as we weren't fully aware of what was happening. But there's no doubt generally that the ice in the Arctic, it used to be when I went to the Arctic that the Inuit with whom I worked, they would know the ice like a local habitat. So they would know when they went out over the ice, they would know where the cracks developed between one side of the bay and the other. They would know where the cracks were going to develop and when they would develop. And they could work confidently out at the ice edge, knowing that the ice was safe behind them. But now that kind of predictability has gone. And it was one of those occasions like that where we were out on the edge of the ice and it should have been fine, but it wasn't. A storm came in bigger than usual and broke up the ice while we were out there, and we basically woke up to find ourselves on an ice floe, basically, with no way of getting back to land. So we had to call up a helicopter to come in and rescue us. Luckily, we weren't too far from a helicopter place, about 80 miles or so, I think we were. But even so, it was kind of worrying for a while, because when we woke up and realized we were on a small piece of ice, it was also fairly heavy fog. So we had to wait until the fog cleared, obviously before the helicopter could come and pick us up. So that was a case. And every year in the Arctic now, you hear about film crews losing equipment or because they stay on ice, you know, too long. So there's no doubt that, you know, within the time that I've been going to the Arctic, which is about 30 odd years, that the old predictability has disappeared. The summers are getting longer, the winters are getting shorter and more mild, and the amount of sea ice in the Arctic is definitely dropping virtually almost every year.
Yeah, it's very alarming to know that humans have been on this planet for so long, and in this short amount of time we managed to do enough to it for something that dramatic to change. But I guess that wasn't the other thing that interests me, besides, I guess, all those environmental issues. That one of the things that stood out the most for me was the time that you almost had your brain sucked out.
Well, you know, working with wild animals, particularly underwater, involves you getting close to them. But we are working sometimes with genuinely wild animals, and there's no way that you can hide often. You certainly can't hide from a polar bear. So all the time you have to be aware of the animals that are around about you. And the main defense that you have against being attacked are two things. First of all, to see the animal. A lot of animals, when they attack you, rely on the element of surprise. But then also it's how you behave when you do see them. You can turn an animal from being aggressive to just curious just by the way you behave. But the walrus was different from that in a way. I was in the water just snorkeling, and I was trying to film some birds that were diving from the surface. So the birds had just gone down and they'd come back up again. And I was just treading water with my head above the water, looking around for where there might be another flock of birds that I could approach. And suddenly something grabbed me around the thighs, and I looked down and I could see the head of a walrus kind of tucked underneath my arm. So I swung the camera around, half pushed, half punched against the head of the walrus, and luckily it let go. It wasn't a particularly big walrus. It was about the same size as me, about, you know, a couple of meters long, something like that. And it swam away a metre and turned and looked at me and then disappeared into the blue. And what had happened was that the walrus had mistaken me for a seal. Walrus usually feed on clams, mussels, what have you, in the muddy seabed, but occasionally they'll go looking for a seal. And the best seal that they can attack is a seal that's sleeping at the surface. Not much chance of catching a swimming seal because they're too fast and too agile. But when a seal goes to sleep at the surface, it just sticks its head up and bobs up and down like a bottle. And me from underwater, where probably the walrus was swimming around the surface and saw my head sticking up, and then dived down, came underneath me, looked up, and I looked like a seal, and up it came and grabbed me. So when I described this to my Inuit friends who had been kind of watching from the shore, they said, "Oh yeah, we've seen walrus attacking seals like that." And you were lucky that it took you low, because what a walrus usually does, it'll take the seal higher on the body, round about the flippers, so that the seal can't swim away. And then to kill the seal, basically it's grabbed the seal round about the upper part of his body. That puts the walrus head up about here relative to the seal. So they bend over, put their lips against the seal's head and suck its brains out. So that didn't happen to me, luckily, but it was the nearest thing. If that walrus had held on, and instead of letting go, if it had held on and just taken me down, then that would have been it, because it was completely unexpected. I was only snorkeling, so I wouldn't have had time to grab a breath or anything. And if it had gone down, held me, then I wouldn't be around. And then it might have sucked my brains out or what have you. But that's the closest. That's the one that I think could have gone either way. And luckily, it went the right way.
I feel like you feel like a cat has 9 lives. Out of all the places you've been and all the animals that you've been around, and that's one of the worst things that's happened. I think you're hardly killed.
Well, I just say, you've got. I mean, I like being close to animals. That's one of the excitements of being underwater, is that you have to be closer to your animal underwater. You can't hide from an animal underwater. If you can see a whale, the whale can see you. And more to the point, if you can see the whale just dimly at the edge of visibility, then you're not going to get any footage. You have to get much, much closer. So that forces you into an intimacy with them. And that's why mammals underwater are so good, because you and me are mammals, and so are dogs and cats and elephants and all the kind of, and that means that every seal you meet or every whale you meet has its own personality, and that makes them exciting to be with. I like working in the poles, as I've said. The thing up in the North Pole, particularly, there you are, you've got this top predator, the polar bear. You can't hide from a polar bear. Polar bears will detect you way before you can detect them, because you can see. Polar bears can see as well as we can, they can hear as well as we can, but they can smell a whole lot better. Polar bear can smell a person on the ice from a mile away. And if they're interested, if it's a curious smell that they want to investigate, then they will hone in on you. And as they get closer, if they do decide to, they want to perhaps attack you, they will show all the guile and cunning in approaching you that they do in approaching seals. So they'll slip into the water, they'll come up using icebergs as cover. They know how to come away round about you and come in from a different direction. So you really have to be on your guard. But that makes it just, that puts a buzz, an edge to it. I do enjoy working in those environments that are, are really wild, and where you can sink into them, and where you're not perhaps filming and then coming back to too civilized surroundings in the evening. It's nice to be out there, maybe living in a cabin or a tent, where you can really sink into the environment. That's the sort of thing that I like.
Where the polar bears can come and knock on your cabin window and try and...
Well, that's kind of inevitable. When you put a cabin close to the shore, when the sea freezes, then the shore, you got all these cracks in the sea ice along the shore, and that's where the seals hang out. So that's where the polar bears spend a lot of time hunting. Now, if you put 2 people in a cabin and they start smelling like humans and cooking up their food and things, then any bear downwind will almost always come and have a look at the cabin. And normally we would put a tripwire fence. If we had snow machines parked outside, we would put a tripwire fence out, 10 metres away from the cabin, all the way around it. Because what you don't want is a bear to, while you're sleeping, a bear to come up and start investigating, chewing away at your snow machine. That's not a good plan. But because we didn't have any snow machines, we didn't have a tripwire fence up. So it meant the bears could come up and look in the window or scratch on the walls or all this sort of stuff. But it wasn't really a problem. We didn't think that the bear was going to break in through the window and attack us. The windows are quite narrow. What we were afraid of more was that this bear was so curious and pushing so hard with its nose that we thought if it breaks the glass with its nose, we've got no spare glass. So we'd have to board up that window, and it was dark enough. So we just kind of went to the side, and we had these big, effectively almost like fireworks, big bangers called thunder flashes. And we just opened the door and struck a thunder flash and tossed it out in the direction of the bear, and it ran away. So it was fine.